Welcome to Wisdom for Life, where we sift through philosophy to find practical advice that you can use in your everyday life. Hi, I'm Dan Hayes. I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Greg Sadler. And today, we're going to be talking about the topic of
giving in to the wrong things. And there's a Greek word for this that we're going to introduce right away, and then we'll define it later on. It's called akrasia, and we often translate this as weakness of will or failure to follow through on things. You can also translate it as a lack or loss of self-control. And it's something that there was a lot of debate about, actually not just in ancient times, but all the way down to the present. Some people say that it doesn't really happen or exist. But I think that we all experience it at one point or another. And what do you think, Dan?
Well, I have a number of papers that I wrote at like 3 a.m. in college, so yes, I think there is something to it.
Now, why would that be particularly relevant to lack of self-control or loss of self-control? It sounds like you actually exercised self-control to get them done, right?
Yeah, well, at the very end, when you have a deadline fast approaching, the uncomfortableness of that tends to outweigh the uncomfortableness of not doing it in the first place.
I've heard quite a few people over the years say that they work better under deadlines. That's usually the tagline for it.
Right.
And I don't know that they actually do better work, like better quality work under the deadline.
They're just forced to do it.
Yeah, they actually get it done.
Right.
So something external motivates them, and maybe it's fear, or shame, or one of these other negative emotions. You can also, I suppose, use anger. I'm going to get this thing done by God.
Right.
To force yourself.
Like the problem with doing that is that the anger also tends to lead you down to some negative other conclusions while you're doing that.
Yeah, it doesn't make for good writing. That's for sure.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of. I don't know. Does what was his name? Hunter S. Thompson seems to have some pretty decent angry prose. I remember his obituary of Nixon being rather cutting. I don't know if that was from anger or just from a deep disdain.
I was just reading something the other day. I got from our local library, because we can do drive up, pickup. Mm-hmm. And I actually walked up there because it's just a few blocks from here at the Central Library. So I'm doing some class videos about Thoreau's civil disobedience. And so I got this text, and it's called Civil Disobedience, but it's got a bunch of his other essays. And one of the ones, I'd never read it before, and I didn't actually know that Thoreau had written on it. I'm not a Thoreau scholar or anything, but it's about John Brown. And it was fascinating to read. John Brown, the great abolitionist who led the raid on Harper's Ferry, but for like a decade before that had been fighting in Missouri against the slaveholders. And it was really interesting to read, in part because Thoreau was criticizing not just the Southerners, but also the Northerners for kind of like hanging this guy out to dry. Mm-hmm. They're like, he's got the right, frame of mind, but he's also kind of nuts. He's, monomaniacal about this. He's not willing to compromise. And Thoreau actually wrote a really interesting piece in which you can tell that Thoreau is angry with his own contemporaries. But it's kind of a measured thing. It's, he's not just writing, just sitting down and knocking it out in one single session. I think there's kind of a measure to it, but it's still, it's very clear that he's upset about the fact that people want to write this person off who seems to have, had a lot of admirable qualities.
Mm-hmm. It once again reminds me of the letter from a Birmingham jail with MLK saying,
the moderates. Yeah.
Yes, the white moderates. They're like, in good time, in due time, we'll get to this. It's like, no, the time is now. Like, equal rights doesn't wait or should not be waiting.
Yeah,
for you to
I mean,
feel good about it.
We're not getting into the topic yet, but I think that is a really important point, that when it comes down to matters of doing the right thing, it's almost never the right time, because there's almost always people there to say, no, let's look at this in another way. Let's be reasonable, or, aren't you worried about your reputation or what might happen to, your profession or your business, or, there's a million reasons not to act. Right.
Right. And going back to the whole idea of the procrastination is this.
Yeah.
The idea here.
Should we put that one off for a bit, or?
Oh, I totally. Yeah. Let's go to the next topic here.
Yeah, we'll come back to it eventually. No, go ahead with procrastination.
A internal versus external locus of control, and this is just like a locus or a center. And that's like, are you doing things because you are the one that's actually motivating you to do things, or are you doing things because other people have put pressure on you to do that? Like, I see it's became actually a really big problem here with the COVID and the lockdown, and that now you don't have to go into work, and you don't have that, like, you have to be there at 9 a.m. or 8 a.m. or 5 a.m. depending on what it is. Like, you do your job when you do your job, and now how do you make sure that you do your work? And I feel like it's caused a lot of people to either sink or swim, to develop a internal locus of control or not, and maybe they're having trouble retaining their jobs in this new out of office environment.
It's interesting because the response of some employers has been to say, we need to install software to make sure that people are actually doing what they say that they're doing as they're working remotely. And okay, so there's probably some people abusing the time and multitasking and all that. But then again, we also tend to try to squeeze every little drop of productivity out of employees a bit more than we ought to. And having something like that coming in is actually going to be detrimental to developing an internal locus of control, right? Because it's just, big brother boss watching you then, I suppose.
Yeah, there's no external locus of control. It's all internal at that point. Or sorry, it's not internal. It's all external. And especially if you're talking about knowledge workers, someone that you're not like not working if you're not like turning that widget every second of the day.
Yeah.
Our idea of a office, especially like pushing paper and whatnot, or all of that, is kind of an out push from our factory work.
Tailor-right management, that sort of thing.
So you're working if your butt's in the seat. But that's for a lot of the things that we do. And
even though, as we know about offices before COVID, very few people were actually getting much done.
Oh yeah, like 60% of the time is not actually productive time.
Yeah.
And so it makes more sense to actually have an output metric. And it's like, okay, we would like you to do this much stuff. And you can either do it really fast or you can do it really slow. It's up to you. And I think that's a much better metric instead of like, are you looking at the screen for 8 hours a day?
Yeah. The idea of being forced to look at a screen 8 hours a day just is such a big turnoff for me anyway. If we stick on this topic before we come back to the akrasia thing, I kind of think that if you're in any sort of knowledge or creative work, and I'm willing to extend that very broadly to, like, say, just writing insurance reports about accidents or something like that, everybody needs some time to think things over and ruminate, and I don't want to say necessarily daydream, about, like, let's say winning the lottery or something like that, but at least some downtime during the time that they're supposed to be productive, and that allows them to be, I think, more productive. This needing to have all these benchmarks met every single hour or something like that, I think actually hinders productivity. When it comes to,
we are not automata.
Yeah. Although, as we were talking about a few episodes ago, maybe we'll be replaced by more productive AIs. So. All right, so let's talk about
Yeah.
this akrasia thing. So, as I mentioned, it's kind of a puzzle in ancient literature, and it continues down to the present, and it has to do with a pretty common experience that we have. So, if we know what the right thing to do is, or we know right from wrong, why doesn't that knowledge bring us to automatically doing it? What's wrong with us? Are we stupid? Are we perverse? Are we misguided? And so in ancient Greece, there was a big, I won't say debate about this, because it's more like one person brings forth one set of ideas, and then a couple of years later, somebody else brings forth another set of ideas. I don't think they actually got in the forum and said, I'm going to talk about, akrasia. I'm going to say there is no such thing. But there are different viewpoints. And it has to do with these experiences that we're all familiar with, like making a commitment to do something that is right or good or needed or useful, and then not following through, like writing the paper, right? It's useful for getting the grade, which is useful for getting the degree, and it's important, and you don't want to let yourself down or your professor down, and yet you wait until 3 a.m. to start the paper. Or being tempted in a situation to not do something that you should do, or do something that you shouldn't, and then giving into it, like going to the gym, and you feel a little tired, so you're like, I'm not going to do all my sets, or you do a set and you're like, I don't have to do 12 reps. 10 is fine. I'll just call that a full set. But you shouldn't do that, right? Mm-hmm. Or having a couple different options in front of you, and option A is the best option, and for some reason you pick option B. What is going on there, right? And we often will say things like, "Oh, I know I shouldn't do this, but this one time it's okay," or it's my birthday, or it's been a long week, or I need to do this in order to get myself ready for the week ahead. There's a million different excuses, right?
You're rationalizing it in some way, and we should probably make this distinction, as Aristotle does, of what is a good rationalization and what's a bad rationalization.
Yeah.
You can use the tricks of the trade of rhetoric to get you to the outcome that you have decided that you wanted, but it might not be actually a good reason to do so.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Just because one can come up with a plausible set of reasons doesn't mean that those are actually good reasons, or that they fit the situation. And and I kind of think that people, when they tell themselves these things over and over again, like, oh, it's because it's Friday and I need to unwind, you do that often enough and that becomes a habit. Mm-hmm. And not just a habit of behavior, a habit of you actually saying that very same thing.
Well, it's just Friday, so I don't have to think anymore.
Yeah.
So I guess to bring out the first formation of this question, I believe it's from the Meno. Socrates is having a dialogue with Meno, and basically makes the conclusion that people do only what they think is the good, and they only do bad things because they are mistaken by what the good really is.
Yeah, they think they're doing something good when they're actually doing something bad, and if they had fuller knowledge about it, then they wouldn't do that bad thing. And it comes up in the Protagoras and in other dialogues as well, and it's a pretty consistent message. And we have all the reason in the world to think that Socrates actually thought and taught this to people. And what do you think about that idea? Do you buy that?
I buy that for a lot of things. It's definitely not every situation falls into this.
Okay.
And so I guess I bought into it more at an early point in my life, but
that's interesting. Now, why?
Just because it I guess intuitively it made a lot of sense, and it jived with some other observations, and then as I got more and more familiar with the full extent of the philosophical conversation happening between him, Plato, and Aristotle, that it was like, okay, they're actually making really good points, and we need to carve out a section of this where these things don't apply, because as I think I spoke about last week, we're not homo economicus. We're not always rational, purely, beneficial beings. Sometimes we do things that are very plainly irrational.
Yeah. I think I also can say that a younger version of myself was more attracted to that idea that the basic problem is of ignorance, that, it's and for those of us who do know the good, then, because we all assume that, we're the ones who know what the good is, then it's up to us to educate or argue or whatever it is to get to these people to see what the genuine good is. And it led me to a lot of conflicts and irritation and a lot of
why
waste.
aren't you doing the right thing? It's so plain. Or I can tell you.
Yeah. That and you get mad at people when you're like, you're just not getting it. And when you start to realize the reasons why people aren't getting it, I think there's two ways you can go. You can be like, see, that's why you're a bad person. Or you can say, oh man, that really sucks to be in that position where you can't actually see right from wrong. Now, when you say that to people, they're not usually very receptive to that, though, right? And so, being able to, for me, I guess you can say, being able to take a more Aristotelian position on these sorts of things has actually made for a better life for me. And I've also come to recognize, too, where I was the one who was mistaken about things and doing something bad, thinking on some level it was good, but also, doing bad things, knowing full well that they're bad, but giving in at that point in time, or having some, mistaken set of dynamics going on, or allowing.
So,
yeah, go
ahead.
Do
you want to describe the Aristotelian position here, or do we want to first hit what Plato was?
Well, let's talk about Plato first, because he's kind of a bridge point, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in the Republic and in the Phaedrus, he puts out an idea of the human being as not being one single unified thing, but actually having parts to our personality or soul. And one part is rational, and we ought to listen to that, provided it's not been corrupted. And then we have the appetites, for food and drink and sex and all sorts of other things. And these are desires. They steer us towards things. They make us want to just lay around and eat chips and do nothing all day and watch Netflix way into the night, binge watching a show, not realizing that
porch and watch the nice girls walk by in their,
sure,
summer dresses or whatever.
Yeah. Was that a Violent Femme song that you're thinking of there?
I'm thinking actually Paint It Black by the Rolling, or is it Stones? I think it's the Stones.
Yeah.
Maybe it's the Doors.
That is, yeah. I was just thinking,
What song?
No, Paint It Black I think is the Rolling Stones.
Yeah. I see those girls by dressed in their summer clothes.
Doing all the things that we're not really supposed to do. That's what the appetites want us to do.
Right. And so he uses the analogy of the charioteer here, correct?
Yeah, well, that's in the Phaedrus. You got the two horses. One's a good horse, one's a bad horse. And the bad horse wants to pull you off in all sorts of directions. The good horse wants to go along the noble path. And then the charioteer, the poor guy, is reason, right? Mm-hmm. But in the Republic, it's just these three parts that are kind of arranged in relation to each other. And the middle part that gets angry and is concerned with honor, that's the part that really makes all the difference. Because rationality will tell us what to do, but by itself, it can't make the desires fall into line. Mm-hmm. So, it's kind of an interesting idea about things. I don't know that we have to buy into it altogether, but what we do get there is that the possibility of being led astray by our desires, knowing what the right thing to do is, but being powerless to enact it unless we will or choose to do so.
It almost seems like a yes and answer to Socrates is like, yes, people can have the correct idea of what the good is and an incorrect idea of what the good is, but there's another thing that's also there that's influencing this.
Yeah, actually, that's a good way to put it. And in the Republic, he does talk about, there's this interesting argument where he says, how do we know that there are parts to the soul? Because otherwise the soul would be doing all just one thing. If it can have conflict, if the parts can, if we can have different themes, different being tugged in different directions, there must be different faculties, different operations going on. I kind of buy that. I don't know that there's 3. I think there's probably more than that. But,
yeah.
Now, if we follow
Fodor
that,
and Carruthers. Sorry.
No, go ahead. What was that?
Something I'd like to get to later, but we might go into it right now is.
Yeah, dude, that's a good idea.
Okay, so some of the more contemporary philosophy of mind touches on these in a very interesting way, and the one that I like is this modular theory of mind, which depending on what philosopher that you're reading has slightly different variables to it, but the 2 main guys are Jerry Fodor and Peter Carruthers. And kind of the basic idea for a modular theory of mind is that we have within our brains, at least at like neurotypical and at like birth, or like at least through the normal stage of development, there are certain portions of our brains that are modular and are for certain things. And so, for example, like the visual cortex is, for the most part, it processes the visual images from our eyes and produces some picture that our conscious mind can understand. And they extend these to, okay, there's like a fear response, and there's like a reproductive response, or there's a hunger response, and these things aren't entirely individual. Sometimes some are subsumed within others, and sometimes they are like Venn diagrams, partly shared
overlapping,
and that's the decision that is eventually made by the conscious mind is that module that basically yells the loudest within the mind. And so, like, the idea of, like, you look at fMRIs and you see which areas light up the most.
Yeah.
And, it's still, this is, cutting edge science, at least, to try to verify these particular positions. But they're making a philosophical, like, we think this is how the mind works, maybe not, but it seems to fit the criteria for the information that we currently have. But this doesn't also removed from the ability that our brain is plastic, and we have lots of experiences of people losing large chunks of their brain, and their brain has been able to remap, motor functions and all sorts of things to places where you would not find in a neurotypical individual.
Yeah. It's interesting. I have a friend who's a psychotherapist, and he was talking about working with trauma patients. Mm-hmm. And he was discussing if you, and it was not just trauma patients, he also trains other psychologists, and he was trying to get them to see that if everything is going to be essentially an amygdala response, you can't do much, right? Because you're going to be stuck in these very fixed sets of responses. If we're talking about decision making, the decision making is going to be very constricted. So you have to find ways to draw a person out of that sort of like almost automatically going down to that level, mm-hmm. in order to be able to start to make progress. And he was pointing out too that this isn't just a matter for patients. This is also a matter for the psychologists or psychiatrists or social workers themselves, because they're tempted to do that sort of thing as well when mm-hmm. they encounter somebody who's like, say, yelling at them in a session. Mm-hmm. So it's, I think there's quite a bit to recommend that. The modular thing too. I was thinking about this with the Plato, just to throw this out there as a little aside. Friedrich Nietzsche looked at the human person as essentially being it's sort of in a modular way, except, we've got kind of a hierarchy of different interconnected things. And instead of it being the one that shouts the loudest, he would say the one with the greatest quanta of will is the one that runs the show. But we're all, according to him, kind of a mess of different stuff that's all kind of cobbled together and hanging together. And there's never going to be any complete unity to it, but we think we're unified all the time. And that's kind of an interesting, I think he's partly right about that. We're definitely not as unified as a lot of the, let's call it, pop psychology or folk psychology models of the human person make us out to be.
Well, we don't have little homunculi within our heads.
Yeah, I think unity is kind of like an ideal rather than something we can automatically assume about human beings.
Yeah, we're kind of messy.
Yeah.
So, another thing that actually turns this practical is that we do know that the way that we learn things is through repeated, if you want to really learn something, you go over and over again, and that every time that you go through the same pathways, the brain actually builds up those pathways, makes them stronger. There's parts of it where they add extra fat molecules in order to increase the
oh really?
Yeah, it increases the insulation.
What does the fat do?
It increases the insulation so that the bioelectrical signals can go through those pathways with less degradation.
Interesting.
Yeah. So the idea is whatever modules that you allow to make your decisions for you, the more apt you're going to go down those same pathways in the future. And so
if you want to keep making the same, say, right decision over and over again, you need to keep practicing that in a variety of situations, right?
Right.
But if you give in to the wrong decisions over and over again,
it makes it more difficult to get out of them.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
That jibes really well with where we're going to be going in just a couple of minutes with Aristotle, actually.
Yeah. So I think we should talk about Aristotle then.
Okay. So Aristotle is, in a certain way, you could say that he's one of the first, at least in his time, scientific psychologists. He devotes a bit more attention from a kind of experiential phenomenological perspective than I think Socrates or Plato did, and he provides us with a more nuanced way of looking at all of this. So he thinks that it's true that there is this weakness of will or failure that we call akrasia, and that it's different from other moral dispositions. So it's not the same thing as having a vice, a bad character trait that is become ingrained in you. It's not the same thing as just making a mistake. It's not the same thing as being placed in forced situations where you just have to pick, the least of the evils. And it's not the same thing as being damaged in the sense of having some sort of organic damage or illness or having been traumatized or anything like that. Instead, you've got a person who's, more or less capable of making the right decisions, but they just don't. Mm-hmm. And so then you got to ask, well, why? And he says, well, what's going on fundamentally is that there's a conflict between parts of ourselves. There's the rational part, or at least a deliberative choice part that we call proiresis, and that's onto what should be the right thing. It could still be wrong, and then you've got these desires or appetites, or sometimes it's that other part that we were talking about is the spirited part of the soul, wanting you to go beat somebody up or respond or retaliate. And there's a conflict. And one's saying, let's do this. The other's saying, no, let's do this instead. And you you give in to the one that's lower in the schema. And there's an opposite to this, which is what he calls enkratia, meaning self-control. It's literally self-mastery, being in charge of yourself. And so here's where it gets really interesting with the neural pathway stuff. Those are in between virtue and vice. The virtuous person finds it fairly easy to do the right thing. They're naturally oriented towards it. So if we're thinking in terms of this sort of physical brain state stuff, they've got the right neural pathways well established and all. What did you say? Like they're fat insulated?
That is one thing that happens.
Okay, so the virtuous person has built up kind of a nexus of this, and the vicious person has built up another nexus. Mm-hmm. In between them are lack of self-control and self-control. And the person who is self-controlled doesn't yet love, doing the virtuous thing, but they know it's the right thing to do, and they make themselves do it. So if we're thinking about like temperance, an example that you and I have kicked around a lot before is like when you go to the all-you-can-eat buffet, really, you shouldn't eat all you can eat. You should lay down some limits. Maybe 4 plates is getting to the extreme, especially if you're going to have like 2 desserts afterwards because you want to get your money's worth, right? So maybe you should only have 3 plates and a soup and 1 dessert. And even that's kind of pushing it, right? So, if you're self-controlled, you say stop at that point, even though you want to have more. Mm-hmm. Whereas the lack of self-control or the uncontrolled person is going to find some reason why that night they should have 5 plates and 2 desserts and 3 soups and, I don't know, bunch of bread rolls.
Yourself.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And they may use that, well, I've paid for it, so I have to get my money's worth thing as an excuse.
But once you get your money's worth, you might be paying for it a second time later when you're feeling very uncomfortable due to your very, very full belly.
That's a good point. And you pay for it in other coin as well. I mean, it's not good for you physically to be eating more than you ought to. So there's a cumulative effect over time. You're also sort of damaging yourself in terms of your self-control the next time that you go in.
Right. And so this is interesting that Aristotle's very much like, oh, you gotta teach your kids right early on.
Oh yeah.
And so this kind of makes sense that like if you can hope to instill certain things early on, it makes it a lot easier for them to actually do those good things going forward into their lives because they've created habits of doing virtuous things and not so many vicious things.
Yeah, I think from Aristotle's perspective, many of us were kind of screwed early on. And we're lucky that we've made as much of ourselves as we have.
Was Freud a fan of Aristotle then?
He knew about Aristotle. Freud actually also knew about Nietzsche too. It's funny that you bring up Freud because my students, whenever I teach them about Plato's tripartite soul, mm-hmm. they've always somewhere heard about Freud and learned about the id, the superego, and the ego, and this triadic relation that Freud has. And they'll say, oh, well, Plato's basically just like Freud. And I'll say, well, no. the id and the appetites, okay, I can see that. They're kind of similar, right? Mm-hmm. The appetites can't control themselves, neither can the id. But the rational part of the soul, if the rational part of the soul is a superego, you're in a lot of trouble, Mm-hmm. And if the thumatic part is your ego, again, you're going to have some problems. So they map on at the lower part, but they don't map on at the higher part.
Yeah, but I was thinking more about the everything's from childhood trauma.
Oh, yeah, I mean,
or a lot of his writings is
with Aristotle, it's less about trauma. It's more about bad habits, mm-hmm. right? But that's actually a great question. I mean, Aristotle, this is a bit of a digression, but he does distinguish another state that he calls brutality or morbid dispositions. And he of course he says barbarians are like this, look at them eating raw flesh over there on the Black Sea. But one of the things that he brings up, and he's very specific about this, is abuse of children. Mm. And he says that this can damage a person so much that you can't even say that they're vicious, because in the vicious person, that rational part of their soul is there. It's just corrupted. It's been screwed up in some way. In a brutalized person, it's been so thoroughly damaged that it doesn't really have much role at all. And the person is reduced to the level of just animality. But human animality is worse than regular animals because there ought to be something else there for us, that would regulate things.
So that kind of comes to like there's definitely a large component of the environment in which someone is raised that will create the habits of how they will be dealing with things. But then if someone really is like, oh well, we could just like save all the kids or something by throwing them into like really nice schools, and then you get like kind of atrocities like you saw with the Native American population here in the United States, and them, trying to westernize them by stealing them away from their parents, putting them into boarding schools, and preventing them from speaking their languages.
Yeah, losing that connection to the people that you've bonded with early on, and losing a language by which you do that. That is really a terrible trauma.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, these people thinking that they're doing the right thing, the good thing to make these people better, but they're actually, once again, it goes back
brutalizing
to
them.
Yeah, and it goes back to the Socrates of like, they think they know what's right, but they don't actually know what's right.
Yeah, and it's interesting when things like that happen. You can say to yourself, "Well, why don't you know that that's right?" And sometimes people will say, oh, well, we can't criticize people of the past because, different times, different mores, different ideas about things. We don't want to be anachronistic. But historians will point out over and over again that almost every time that we see something like that being done as a norm, there's somebody who's like, this is bad. You should not be doing this. There's always social critics resisting that in some way and pointing out that isn't the only possible way. And I think that's actually one of the really valuable things about history is bringing those other voices back to life. To bring this back to what we were talking about before, there were a lot of people at around the time of the Civil War who were like, listen, slavery, terrible thing, but, it's much more important that we keep the Union together, or that we have compromises about this, or that, we'll weed it out over a couple generations. And somebody like John Brown came around and said, listen, God told me that this is wrong, and I'm just going to pursue this. And then he's looked at as a complete madman. If he'd said something like, I have a logically deductive argument for why this is wrong, and he didn't bring God into the picture, maybe he wouldn't have been seen as crazy, but, or maybe he would.
But there was also lots of use of religion to
perpetuate. Yeah.
So.
And so John Brown is a great example of somebody who didn't just like go with the mores of his time. He was like, this is definitely wrong. The early Republicans, who we know, the radical Republicans were founded here in Wisconsin,
in Milwaukee.
Ripon, I think, right?
Oh,
is where they had their first thing.
I thought there's a plaque downtown that says like this is like maybe it was like the first like official convention or something, whatever.
That very well could be, because this is the most important city, and we had quite a few anti-slavery people come out of Milwaukee. But so I mean, with anything, you can find somebody to say, yeah, this isn't the right thing to do, and maybe there's like, even in totalitarian societies where one of the things that's key to them is like driving the conscience out of people and making it almost impossible for them to speak up. There's still some people who are like, yep, this is wrong. You shouldn't do this. So we do have, some possibility of gaining knowledge about what's right and wrong available to us much of the time. We just often ignore it.
Right. And it seems like we're in one of those inflection points where certain things are definitely becoming, oh, well, enough people have decided this is wrong that we're actually going to make it wrong.
Yeah, and that's something that I have guarded optimism about. I think if I were 20 years younger, I'd be very optimistic. But I think, when you look back over history, you see how easy it is for things that are on the right track to fall apart or to go in the wrong directions. But
if you look at, like, for example, South Africa, he was just Mandela was a political prisoner on Robben Island, and 20 years later, he's the leader of the country.
Yeah.
of the most racist, basis of government in the entire world to having a black president. That's an amazing turnaround.
Yeah, and I think that another thing that we can say about Mandela too was his commitment to not engaging, and this is where he ends up breaking with his wife and the ANC as well. Not a commitment to not pursuing sort of okay, we're on top now, everybody's going to suffer under us kind of strategy that you see like happening, almost next door in Zimbabwe under the Mugabe regime, still with its effects going on today. Yeah, I mean, we're getting far from our topic, but we could say that in a lot of cases, political leaders have to struggle with this issue of self-control as well. We see nowadays that. Oh, go ahead.
All right, do you do the things that you think will get you power? Do you do the things that you think will actually be right? And there's that strong pull to just, oh yeah, I can say the most vile things because it's definitely going to rile up my base, whichever way. But is that actually going to produce the good rule, a functioning government that actually provides the services that we as populace expect from that?
Yeah, I think too. So there is that. There's the demagoguery we call that, but I think there's another challenge for politicians as well, which is they say, oh, I'm going to get into this and I'm going to change the system from within. And then there's all these decisions where if you want to move up, you got to do a favor for this person and do a favor for this person. And it's at the expense of somebody else. And it's usually unjust in some way. And I think there's probably, the best way to get somebody to do that, of course, is you get them a little bit drunk and then get them into a back room and you say, you need to make a decision about this now because, what side are you on? I think there's a lot of tendencies towards akrasia when it comes to those sorts of little compromises, and I think you can extend that as well to education and to the corporate world. There's this tendency to cut corners and, make things easier for oneself, even when one knows that on some level it's wrong. And if you do it long enough, it becomes, second nature.
We're such social creatures that someone comes up to you and says, oh yeah, you got the power and we're friends and could you just do this little thing? It's not much. And that's that first little step that chinks away at what your ideals are. You give in, and then you give in a little bit more and more, and it, I guess it snowballs. I don't want to make a slippery slope argument, though.
When I was teaching in Indiana State Prison, it was very important not to accept any favors from a prisoner, even to the point of if they give you a candy, don't accept the candy, and you don't do anything outside of the bounds of what the scope of your job is for prisoners either. And the reason is because there is a slippery slope, and not all of them. I mean, I actually met some really great people while I was teaching in the prison, but I also met some other people who were much more questionable. And I met a few people where the other prisoners would say, I hope that guy never gets out because he scares the hell out of me, but it was the middle ground of the prisoners that you had to really watch out for, because if you do this favor, then there's two things going on. They'll say, well, if you did that favor, why won't you do this favor? It's reasonable for you to do that. And then if you don't do it, then they'll also say, well, if you don't do that favor for me, I'm going to reveal that you also did this favor, and then you're going to get in trouble. So there's a push-pull. And this is how we get people, carrying in cell phones and bags of marijuana and all sorts of crazy stuff where you're like, what the hell went wrong with this? Engaging in trafficking. And I don't think you have to just look at prisons in order to see that there are many people willing to take advantage of our akrasia, if we allow ourselves to be acratic. Some of them just, it's not so personally motivated, but some of them will get their hooks into you and just keep going and going and going.
Yeah, it's got to be I guess a high pressure teaching environment to try to deal with.
Oh, in a prison?
Yeah.
That's interesting because once you establish a reputation for not being readily corruptible. You don't have to like pretend to be incorruptible and be the, man of steel or something like that. It's just like any other thing security oriented. Your house doesn't have to be a castle. It just has to be more visibly secure than the house next door, and they won't break into your house, So I think you can say that about people's reputations as well. Once people realize, this guy isn't going to take a candy from me or do me a little favor, there's no point in trying. They're not going to waste their time on you. And it's not like they respect you because of that. It's more just, you're not a mark.
Right. So do you want to hit one more topic or go to the question?
Yeah. So I do want to talk about one other thing with Aristotle. He thinks that there's a number of different things that we can have a lack of self-control about. And I don't think his list is exhaustive, but I think it is quite interesting how he breaks it down. He thinks that, pleasure and pain, like trying to avoid pain and trying to get things that we find pleasant is like the core meaning of akrasia. But the other things where we have a lack or loss of self-control that he lists are these: anger. And this is where he makes an argument that, well, akrasia with respect to anger, not so bad as with respect to pleasure, because anger at least is rational. That's a little bit debatable. Love of victory or success, philonikia in Greek.
Okay.
Nikia Nike
victory.
Yeah. And so beating other people, right? When we want to be right, when we want to go faster than other people, or we want to be celebrated, even if we're actually wrong, we want to be the one who's acknowledged as successful. Money, of course, that's kind of a common thing. There's lots of people. Yeah, except in this case, it's not the vice of avarice. It's just a lack of self-control when it comes to this. And if you keep giving into it, you will become avaricious. But you're not yet there. You're like, well, I should go to my kids' recitals, but there is this side gig, and I do feel bad about it. Whereas the vicious person is like, screw the kids' recital. Everybody's got to earn as much money as possible. Talk to the kid. Recitals don't pay for your braces, or something like that. But then the other thing that he says that's really interesting: kids and parents. Now think about how many people they're pretty decent people, but when it comes to their kids, they will like do all sorts of underhanded things to advance their kids, who usually aren't worth advancing, or they'll do this for parents, or they'll do this for other family members or friends or other relationships.
And see as one portion of that is like the living vicariously through the lives of your children, and seeing your children as an extension of yourself, and willing to do what needs to be done to get ahead, and extending that to your children. Yeah, that's a good point. But yeah, like what is it? The recent-ish scandal of like getting kids into college, paying millions of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars. Yeah. Yeah.
Now I think some of those people were really vicious because they were like, this is what everybody does. I didn't do anything wrong here. The ones that were actually saying, yeah, I know I shouldn't do this, but it's my kid. They could be said to be akratic. Yeah.
As well as the people facilitating that would also definitely be vicious.
The ones who took the bribes. Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting one.
They may have been akratic the first time. It's like, like I'm hard up for money or something, and I have this access, and like one little thing, one little favor is not going to kill me, but once you do it, it becomes a little bit easier to do. And
yeah, and it might have been tied in too with like you're a little bit starstruck because this is a famous person or somebody who's got some real pull, and wow, they're paying attention to me. They invited me out to their beach house or out on their yacht. And then they're giving me the pitch.
Right. Yeah.
That's a great example. Yeah.
I patted your back. You want to pat my back?
Yeah. Yachts are good for that because if they won't pat your back, then you can push them off the side.
Because of the implication. You're familiar with the. Okay, so we have a question here. hey, so I have an essay I need to write, and it's pretty personal, so it's already tough to write, but I have procrastinated for a week already, and I feel intensely guilty about the fact that I wasted all this time. Whenever I start trying to write, I just feel extremely guilty and anxious, and so I start browsing Reddit instead to distress. The worst thing is that there's no deadline, so the panic from the deadline can't overcome the negative feelings and force me to do it. I just need to finish this as soon as possible, preferably today. Do you have any suggestions on how I can overcome this guilt and start working?
That's a good one. There's two things there, right? There's the whole procrastination thing, but then there's how do I deal with the guilt?
Mm-hmm.
So you have some thoughts on this one, right?
Like the first one is just a simple method that I found to be very useful, and like the biggest hurdle with procrastination from my experience, as well as from what I've read out there as solutions, is just getting started. And you sit there and you make every excuse, and it's like, oh well, I can do the dishes, and so you go do the dishes, and you sit down and you're like, and I can fold my clothes, and you go and fold your clothes, and you come back, and the dog needs to go for a walk, and I need to take a shower, and it's like, oh, but it's bedtime, so I'll just do this in the morning. And the idea is to take, if you see it, I've got a little timer here, little kitchen timer, and you just put it for 15 minutes. It's the Pomodoro method, and you say, I'm going to write for 15 minutes, and you don't stop writing for 15 minutes, and once you've done that for 15 minutes, then you can go on to the rest of it. It's this idea of this giant insurmountable thing, and you're breaking it down to, oh, I can definitely write for 15 minutes. That's easy. I can do that.
That's true. And once you've gotten started, oftentimes it can go much more smoothly. Although another thing that a lot of writers have problems with is they write something and then they immediately start self-editing, self-criticizing, and that's not a good thing to do either, right? When I'm working with people, I always say write more than you need, because then you can trim it. Don't like say, oh, this is garbage, I'm not going to put this down on paper, because that just stops you.
Right. You want to get into that zone, to that flow state. Just write, I guess.
That I have been in, and that is really enjoyable. When I would write student papers, I would now back then I was smoking, so I would get myself a couple packs of cigarettes, or I'd roll up a whole bunch of cigarettes, and then I'd start making pots of coffee, and I'd have all my research materials piled up around me, and I'd just start writing, and I'd put some music on too, and I would just go, and it might take me 8 hours, it might take me 24 hours, but I would at the end of it have a pretty polished paper, but not completely. You just get it to the point where you've got your thoughts down, and then I would crash, go to sleep for maybe 24 hours, then get up, and then start doing all the, making it look nice kind of stuff. Now, that's not a great way to do things as you get older.
Yeah. I can no longer do all-nighters. They kill me now.
Yeah.
Oh. And then I guess the other question is about the guilt, correct?
Yeah. So what do you think about that?
Well, those things that happened in the past are in the past. They are immutable, unchangeable, and the only thing that they're good for is to be a lesson for you on either what to do or what not to do in the present moment. And so if you can just let go of the past and say, I have a task in front of me, I don't need to worry about anything that's happened in the past, I can't change it. If that actually, that's theory, and you have to actually practice that to, try to, put this thought into action, though.
I think too with guilt, you have to ask, well, guilty towards whom? Guilt is something that we feel relationally. It's not just something that we have, and it doesn't have any sort of, you're guilty because you're worried about what so-and-so might think of you. And you also feel maybe guilty in relation to yourself, like you let yourself down. And so, yeah, what you're saying is really helpful. Maybe thinking about, did you really let yourself down? Is this something that you could, recuperate by actually doing it? That might be helpful as well. The other thing I was going to say too, So if you don't want to be acratic, it's probably good to cut down on temptations. And this might be one of the biggest temptations when you're writing, because we've got all these apps at our fingertips.
Just for us that are not on the video, he's holding up his cell phone.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, you know, I struggle with this. It's too easy to go and look at what's going on Twitter, or what's happening on Facebook, or did somebody say something on one of my videos, or, you know, checking the news, or looking at email, or any of those sorts of things. It might be good to put your cell phone in another room. You know, you can put it on so if somebody calls you on the phone or texts you, you can hear it. That might be one distraction that you have to put aside. Yeah. And there's probably other distractions too. You mentioned cleaning up the house, taking the dog for a walk.
When you're in the midst of hardcore procrastination, you will find the most boring, mundane things, and that is going to be the most exciting thing you've ever done. But I think we need to move on to our practice.
Yeah. So do you want to lead us through this, or?
I
can do it too.
You can do that. Yeah, let's do that.
So one of the things that you can do when you're finding yourself not getting things done, not doing what you ought to do, is taking a matter in which you want to develop more self-control. Like, it could be the buffet, it could be going to the gym and doing all of your exercises, it could be calling a person who you're supposed to have called a while ago and then didn't and now feel guilty about, or anything along these lines. And when you're in that situation, you remind yourself that this is a chance that you have. You have a goal, and this is a matter that does tempt you. By struggling against it here and now, you're not just doing it for here and now, you're helping yourself in the future. Mm-hmm. So there's kind of a stake that you're dealing with. And you can't just say to yourself, oh, it's just this little thing here or this little thing here. You can tell yourself, I am actually helping to establish better habits for myself. And you might use that as a mantra. You could say, by choosing the right thing now, I'm choosing for myself later on. And if you do that, in one thing, you'll learn how to do that. And then you can transfer that to other things as well. So if you can learn how to, wash the dishes when they're sitting in the sink instead of letting them just keep piling up. Right? Or what are other things that we struggle with? What's your biggest weakness or
weakness? Let's see.
They say you're
not reading the
right?
news.
Okay.
Yeah. I'll actually write that down on my planner. It's like, don't read the news until at least afternoon, because I know that it is something that I'm drawn towards. And it becomes negative both emotionally and mentally, and it's not good for me. But I do it anyways.
So when you draw yourself in, or when you do that, you can say, okay, I'm setting myself a pattern for this, and then you can transfer that to whatever the next thing is.
Right. And another way to look at this is through ways of reframing.
Good.
And for example, you can say is like, all life is like, look at it as like a video game, and that you have all these times that you have as examples of like, okay, I have a goal, and I have times to try to get this thing right, and it's okay if I fail, as long as I know I'm still progressing towards that goal. Or I guess William Irvine brought out a book not too long ago called The Stoic Challenge, which talks about reframing, and his added reframing is that you've got some sort of stoic god, regardless if you think it exists or not, but he is putting challenges in front of you as a test. And so it's like he's saying, here's the test, and if you make it through it, you become a better person.
That sounds good. So we've got to end.
So we've got
lead us out.
Final words from William Somerset Maugham. Self-control might be as passionate and as active as the surrender to passion.